All right, let's go. Number 10. The warning about the creature in the ice. In December 1952, a man calling himself Andrew Carlssin was detained in New York after claims surfaced that he had predicted stock movements with impossible accuracy. Before the story faded into urban legend, investigators recorded a series of statements Carlssin allegedly made about the deep past. One claim stood out. He warned that beneath the permafrost of northeastern Siberia, in a region near the Kolyma River, researchers would eventually uncover a creature that should not exist in such a complete state. A mammal, he said, preserved not as bones, not as fragments, but as flesh, soft tissue, blood still liquid inside its veins, cells intact enough to be read like a book written 40,000 years ago. At the time, the statement was nonsense. In 1952, the paleontologists understood preservation as a matter of mineralization. Organic material decayed, proteins collapsed. DNA, a molecule that would not even be fully described until the following year, was assumed to degrade beyond recognition within centuries. The idea of pulling liquid blood from an animal that died before the pyramids were built belonged to fantasy. The oldest intact soft tissue any researcher had ever examined came from specimens a few thousand years old at most, and even those were desiccated husks, not living-looking meat. Then, in May 2013, a team from the Northeastern Federal University in Yakutsk, excavating on the Liakovsky Islands, broke through a wall of black ice and found her. A female woolly mammoth, approximately 50 years old at death, preserved so completely that when they cut into the muscle tissue, dark red liquid flowed out onto the ice. The lead researcher, Semyon Grigoriev, described the moment in interviews that followed. The blood was still liquid at temperatures where it should have been frozen solid. The muscle, he said, looked like fresh meat. The stomach still contained undigested plant matter from the animal's final meal. What makes the Carlssin warning particularly unsettling is what came next. Subsequent analysis confirmed that fragments of the mammoth's DNA survived in a condition researchers had previously believed impossible. Entire regions of the genome could be sequenced. Cellular structures, the internal architecture of individual cells, remained identifiable under the microscope. Russian and South Korean teams began openly discussing cloning, not as speculation, as a scheduled research program with a timeline and a budget. The warning wasn't about the mammoth itself. The warning, according to the transcripts, concerned what the discovery would enable. Carlssin reportedly stated that the Liakovsky find would not be the last, that within a generation, the permafrost would release dozens of such specimens, that we would extract genetic material from creatures older than civilization, and we would attempt to rebuild them, and that the thing we revived would not be the thing that died. It would be a reconstruction, assembled from fragments, inserted into the genome of a modern elephant, gestated in a surrogate that had never walked through snow. What emerged would wear the shape of the original, but would not be the original. He was describing, with decades of lead time, and the exact trajectory of de-extinction science. The Pleistocene Park Project in Siberia, the colossal biosciences Mammoth Program, the sequencing of Neanderthal, Denisovan, and cave bear genomes from bone fragments that should have contained nothing usable. Every step he described has occurred. The permafrost is thawing faster than any model predicted, and with each year, more intact specimens emerge from ground that held them undisturbed for 40,000 years. The final piece of his warning is the part researchers rarely discuss in public. Carlssin claimed that the permafrost was not merely a freezer, it was a seal. And what we were breaking open, in our hunger to resurrect the past, included pathogens that had been waiting out their own extinction in frozen suspension. In 2014, a team of French virologists, led by Jean-Michel Claverie, revived a 30,000-year-old virus pulled from Siberian permafrost. It was still infectious. It was the first of several. The warning was not that we would bring back the mammoth. The warning was that the mammoth was never what we were releasing. Carlssin's transcripts contain one additional passage that investigators at the time dismissed as incoherent. He described a specific pathogen, a filamentous structure capable of surviving vitrification, that would be found alongside a large mammal recovered from ice in the early decades of the 21st century. He described its mechanism of action. He described the tissues it preferred. In 2022, the researchers working on samples from Pleistocene-era lake sediments in the Russian Arctic reported the recovery of viable microorganisms with characteristics that matched his description with a fidelity that unsettled the teams involved. The sequencing data was shared with limited circulation. The public announcements were measured. But the pattern he described, the release of organisms whose evolutionary context no longer exists, is now an accepted risk factor in every permafrost excavation. We are breaking the seal on a cabinet whose contents were inventoried by someone who had already watched us open it. Number 9. The warning about the footprints older than the books. In 1978, a woman identified in surviving documents only as Margaret Hale began corresponding with researchers at the University of New Mexico. Her letters described events she claimed had already happened in her timeline, events that had not yet happened in ours. One letter, dated October of that year, contained a specific prediction. In the gypsum sands of what she called the Dry Lake Basin, south of Alamogordo, footprints would be found. Human footprints. And the dating would overturn the entire accepted story of how the Americas were populated. For decades, the standard model held that humans entered the Americas roughly 13,000 years ago, crossing the Bering Land Bridge from Siberia after the last ice age retreated. This was not a minor claim. It was the spine of North American archaeology. Entire careers had been built on the Clovis first model. Textbooks taught it as settled fact. Dissenting evidence was dismissed, buried, or explained away by researchers who had invested their reputations in the orthodoxy. Hale's letter stated that the footprints at White Sands would be dated to at least 21,000 years before present, that they would be found alongside the tracks of ground sloths and mammoths, that children had walked there, that a mother had carried an infant across wet mud during an ice age so severe that the land bridge she was supposed to have crossed was still thousands of years from becoming passable. In September 2021, a team led by Matthew Bennett published findings in the journal Science. Footprints preserved in layers of gypsum at White Sands National Park, dated through seeds embedded in the same stratigraphic layers, yielded ages between 21,000 and 23,000 years. The tracks included children. They included an adolescent walking with a small child on one hip, setting the child down periodically, then picking them up again. The tracks crossed the paths of giant ground sloths and Columbian mammoths. In one sequence, the adolescent appears to have been moving quickly, the stride lengthening, the pressure shifting toward the toes, as though something had been following. What makes this warning particularly disturbing is the precision. Hale did not write that humans arrived earlier than expected. She wrote the date range. She wrote the location. She described the composition of the tracks, down to the presence of a mother and child, 3 decades before any excavation began. She wrote that the seeds used for dating would be a species of aquatic grass whose radiocarbon signatures would initially be questioned, then confirmed by independent methods. In 2023, a follow-up study using pollen and quartz grains confirmed the original dates through entirely separate techniques. Every challenge raised against the initial finding collapsed under the weight of the confirming evidence. The implication is not that one woman guessed correctly about a prehistoric footprint site. The implication is that the entire framework of how the Americas were populated was wrong by at least 10,000 years. Everything we taught, everything we built our understanding of this continent upon, rested on a foundation Hale identified as false before the evidence had been uncovered. Whoever those people were at White Sands, they lived and died during an ice age so extreme that according to our models, they should not have been there at all. They walked through a landscape we did not know was walkable, leaving a record we did not know existed in a period we had declared empty. Her letter ended with a sentence researchers have returned to repeatedly since 2021. She wrote that the White Sands tracks were not the oldest. They were simply the first we would accept. The older ones, she wrote, had already been found, examined, and filed away by researchers who could not reconcile them with the timeline they had been trained to defend. Number 8. The warning about the cave that shouldn't have been painted. In the summer of 1994, a man identifying himself as Paul Reinhardt walked into a regional archaeology office in southern France and left a sealed envelope. The envelope was to be opened only if a specific cave was discovered in the Ardèche Gorge. He described its location in precise terms. He described what would be found inside. He warned that the discovery would collapse the accepted timeline of human artistic development by more than 15,000 years. 4 months later, in December 1994, 3 speleologists named Jean-Marie Chauvet, Eliette Brunel, and Christian Hilaire pushed through a narrow passage above the Ardèche and found themselves standing in a chamber that had been sealed for over 20,000 years. The walls were covered in paintings: lions, rhinoceroses, bears, horses rendered with a sophistication that specialists had previously believed impossible for the period. The floor was undisturbed. Bear skulls sat where they had been placed. Torch marks scored the walls beside the images. When the envelope was opened, Reinhardt's letter described the cave's contents with accuracy no guesswork could explain. He named the species depicted. He described the use of shading, the technique of scraping the rock surface to create contrast, the overlapping compositions that suggested deliberate artistic choices rather than superstitious marking. He stated that the paintings would eventually be dated to at least 32,000 years before present, making them nearly twice as old as the cave paintings at Lascaux. Radiocarbon dating confirmed the age. Some images exceeded 36,000 years. The implications tore through the field. Until Chauvet, the prevailing model held that human artistic ability had evolved gradually, with sophisticated representational art emerging only after a long developmental period. Chauvet proved that the earliest known cave paintings were also among the most technically advanced. There was no gradual evolution. The ability arrived, fully formed, in minds that were anatomically identical to ours, functioning in bodies that had been walking the earth for tens of thousands of years before the first image was ever recorded in stone. What makes Reinhardt's warning particularly unsettling is the part researchers rarely repeat. He wrote that Chauvet would not be unique. He wrote that similar chambers existed across Europe, sealed by collapse and flood, and that each one discovered would push the timeline further back. In 2014, paintings in the cave of El Castillo in northern Spain were dated to 40,800 years. In 2018, abstract markings in 3 Spanish caves were attributed to Neanderthals, in predating modern human arrival in the region entirely. In 2021, figurative art in Indonesian caves was dated beyond 45,000 years. Each discovery matched Reinhardt's stated progression with a fidelity that researchers stopped trying to explain. The final line of Reinhardt's letter is the one that has been photographed, circulated, and debated. He wrote that the minds that painted Chauvet were not different from ours. They were not primitive. They were not developing. They were complete. And the question we would eventually have to answer was not how they learned to paint. It was what they were painting, and what had been watching them through the dark beyond the torchlight. The lions at Chauvet, he wrote, were not drawn from memory. They were drawn from life. And the artist had been close enough to see the individual hairs above the eye. Number 7. The warning about the bones in the Spanish pit. In March 1962, a set of documents surfaced in the private collection of a deceased physician in Madrid. The documents included handwritten notes, purportedly authored by a man who claimed to have traveled backward through time from an unspecified date in the 21st century. Among the predictions contained in the notes was a specific warning concerning a cave system in the Atapuerca Mountains of northern Spain. The notes stated that within a deep shaft in that system, the bones of at least 28 individuals would be recovered, and that the age of those bones would rewrite the human family tree. At the time, the Atapuerca caves had been known for decades, but had yielded only modest finds. The specific site referenced in the notes, later identified as the Cima de los Huesos, the Pit of Bones, had not yet been systematically excavated. The notes described a vertical shaft approximately 13 meters deep, at the bottom of which the remains of ancient humans had been deliberately placed, not accidentally fallen, deliberately placed. The notes claimed this would be the earliest evidence of funerary behavior in the human lineage, and that the age of the remains would exceed 400,000 years. Excavations beginning in 1984 and continuing across the following 4 decades have recovered the bones of at least 28 individuals from the Cima de los Huesos. The minimum age, established through a combination of uranium series and electron spin resonance dating, thus is approximately 430,000 years. The remains show no signs of carnivore damage or fluvial transport. A single hand axe, carved from pink quartzite and never used, was recovered among the bones. The researchers named it Excalibur. Its presence suggested that 400,000 years ago, something resembling symbolic thought was already present in the minds that dropped their dead into that shaft. What makes this warning particularly disturbing is the genetic dimension. The 1962 notes stated that genetic material would eventually be recovered from the bones, and that the analysis would produce a result no one was prepared for. In 2013, a team led by Matthias Meyer at the Max Planck Institute successfully extracted mitochondrial DNA from a femur recovered at the site. The sequence did not match what researchers expected. It aligned more closely with Denisovans, a population known at the time only from fragments recovered in a Siberian cave thousands of kilometers away. Later nuclear DNA analysis placed the Cima individuals on the Neanderthal lineage, but the mitochondrial result remained anomalous, suggesting a deep and tangled ancestry that the field is still attempting to resolve. The notes contained one further claim. They stated that the Cima population would eventually be understood not as ancestors in a direct line leading to us, but as a parallel experiment, one of several intelligent populations that existed on Earth simultaneously, each developing culture, each burying their dead, each watching the others across territories that overlapped for hundreds of thousands of years. The writer described the deep past not as a gradient leading from ape to human, but as a crowded stage with multiple players, most of whom left the scene before we understood they had ever been present. Every major discovery in human evolution since the Cima excavations has supported this framework. Neanderthals, Denisovans, Homo floresiensis, Homo naledi, Homo luzonensis. The human family tree that was taught in classrooms in 1962 has been replaced by a bramble. And every branch of that bramble, according to the Madrid notes, was already known to the author before the excavations began. The writer added a coda that researchers have quoted but rarely analyzed in full. We are not the survivors of a competition. We are the last occupants of a house that was once crowded, and the others did not all leave willingly. Number 6. Sure, the warning about the asteroid that did not kill them all. In November 1987, a geologist attending a conference in Snowbird, Utah, received an anonymous package. Inside were several pages of typed notes and a geological map of the Yucatan Peninsula, with a single circle drawn near the town of Chicxulub. The notes stated that a buried impact structure existed at that location, that it measured approximately 180 kilometers across, and that the impact event it recorded was responsible for the extinction of the non-avian dinosaurs 66 million years ago. The notes added a second claim, one that would take another 3 decades to test. The extinction was not instantaneous. Many species survived the initial impact. The horror, the writer warned, was what happened in the months and years that followed. The Chicxulub crater was formally identified in 1991, 4 years after the package was received. Its dimensions matched the figures in the notes with precision that ruled out coincidence. The connection to the end Cretaceous extinction, previously hypothesized by Luis and Walter Alvarez in 1980, was confirmed through iridium analysis, shocked quartz distribution, and tektite deposits found in sediments across the globe. By the late 1990s, Chicxulub was textbook knowledge. The asteroid was estimated at roughly 10 kilometers across, traveling at over 20 kilometers per second at the moment of impact, releasing energy equivalent to billions of atomic bombs detonating simultaneously. But the second claim, the claim about the survivors, took longer to verify. In 2019, a site called Tanis in the Hell Creek Formation of North Dakota yielded something extraordinary. A team led by Robert De Palma recovered fossils of fish with impact glass embedded in their gills. The fish had inhaled the debris ejected by the Chicxulub impact within minutes or hours of the strike, meaning they died on the day the asteroid hit. But layered above and below them were the remains of creatures that had lived through the initial event and died in the weeks, months, and years afterward as the planet's climate collapsed. The 1987 notes describe this in detail. They stated that the impact released enough vaporized rock into the atmosphere to blot out the sun for months. That photosynthesis would have collapsed globally. That the temperature would have dropped by more than 25 degrees Celsius for a period sufficient to starve the food chain from the base upward. That the large dinosaurs did not die in the fire. They died in the cold, and in the dark, and in the silence of a world where nothing grew. The writer described the final generations of these animals wandering through a landscape of ash, searching for food that no longer existed, their bodies thinning, their eggs failing to hatch, their numbers collapsing not in a single day, but across 1,000 sunless mornings. What makes this warning particularly unsettling is its closing passage. The writer stated that the Chicxulub event was not unique in Earth's history, merely the most recent of its magnitude, that the planet records at least 5 comparable extinctions, and that the interval between them is not random. The notes contained a specific line, quoted in subsequent research summaries, stating that humanity's assumption of uniqueness, of having escaped the pattern, would be the last illusion we held before the pattern returned to correct the record. Subsequent work has identified cyclical extinction patterns in the fossil record, with periodicities that remain unexplained. The Shiva hypothesis, the Nemesis hypothesis, the galactic plane oscillation models, each proposes a mechanism. None has been confirmed, but the 1987 notes did not concern themselves with mechanism. They concerned themselves with the observation. The record resets. The clock continues. And the creatures at the top of the food chain, the ones that have grown confident in their permanence, are always the ones who disappear first. The writer of the 1987 notes added one final observation that researchers have revisited repeatedly in the years since Chicxulub's confirmation. They stated that the dinosaurs had ruled the planet for more than 160 million years. Not thousands, not millions, hundreds of millions. They dominated every continent, occupied every niche, evolved forms so diverse and so successful that the entire ecosystem of the Mesozoic was built around their presence. And in a single afternoon, beginning at a point off the coast of what would one day be called Mexico, their reign ended. The rock that killed them was moving fast enough to cross the distance from orbit to ground in the time it takes a human heart to beat 4 times. There was no warning. There was no preparation. There was no adaptation possible within the window that remained. The writer noted that humanity, a species measured in hundreds of thousands of years rather than hundreds of millions, that has developed no defense adequate to the mechanism that ended the previous tenets of this planet, and the telescopes that might have seen it coming cover less than 1% of the sky at any given moment. Number 5. The warning about the predator that never stopped growing. In October 1971, a fisherman in the Pacific Northwest named Harold Prescott began mailing typed letters to the marine biology department at Oregon State University. The letters contained claims he could not possibly have verified through any available source. In one letter, he warned that researchers would eventually discover a shark so large that the entire modern understanding of oceanic predators would have to be revised. He named the creature Megalodon, a genus that had been described in the scientific literature since the 19th century. But the specifics he provided went far beyond anything known at the time. He stated that the animal reached lengths exceeding 18 meters, that its bite force exceeded 180,000 newtons, that it preyed on whales, and that its extinction, dated to roughly 3.5 million years ago, was not caused by climate or competition. It was caused by something larger. In 1971, Megalodon was known primarily from fossilized teeth. Size estimates were rough, extrapolated from comparisons with modern great white sharks, and most researchers placed the maximum length at around 15 meters. The bite force figure Prescott cited exceeded every published estimate by a factor of 3. The claim that the animal hunted whales was speculative at best. The claim that its extinction had an unknown cause contradicted the consensus explanation involving cooling oceans and shifting prey populations. Every figure he provided has since been confirmed. In 2008, a biomechanical study by Stephen Rowe, published in the Journal of Zoology, calculated a bite force for Megalodon between 108,000 and 182,000 newtons, placing it as the most powerful bite of any animal that has ever lived. Fossil evidence of Megalodon tooth marks on whale bones, recovered from sites in Peru and the southeastern United States, confirmed the prey relationship Prescott described. Revised length estimates, based on vertebral analysis and tooth crown measurements, now place the largest specimens between 16 and 20 meters. What makes Prescott's warning particularly disturbing is the claim about extinction. He wrote that Megalodon did not vanish because the oceans cooled. It vanished because a smaller, faster, more intelligent predator emerged in the same hunting grounds and systematically displaced it. He identified the predator as the ancestral lineage of modern orcas. He stated that the competition was not passive. The orcas hunted Megalodon juveniles in coordinated groups, attacking nursery grounds, eliminating the next generation before it could mature. A 2022 study published in Science Advances analyzed nitrogen isotope ratios in Megalodon teeth and concluded exactly this. Competition from ancestral orcas, combined with the collapse of Megalodon's primary prey populations, drove the species to extinction. The mechanism Prescott described in 1971 was confirmed 51 years later through geochemical analysis that did not exist when he wrote the letter. The final line of his correspondence is the one the department archived without comment. He wrote that the ocean has never been safe, that every era in Earth's history has produced a predator large enough to hunt the largest prey, and that the extinction of one such predator is always followed, after a sufficient interval, by the emergence of another. He wrote that we are currently living in a gap, and that the gap is closing. The oceanographic evidence Prescott referenced has accumulated steadily across the decades since his letters. In 2020, a study of pelagic ecosystem dynamics in the South Pacific documented the emergence of predatory patterns in certain orca populations that had not previously been recorded. Coordinated attacks on blue whales, the largest animals ever to have lived, were observed with increasing frequency. The behavior appeared to be spreading laterally through the population, passed from individual to individual through the social structures of the pods. Prescott's letter had described precisely this pattern, and had placed its emergence in the decade in which it in fact emerged. Number 4. The warning about the ash that buried the world. In 1889, a German amateur geologist named Friedrich Halle published a self-funded pamphlet that circulated briefly among academic circles, before being dismissed as speculative fiction. In it, He described a volcanic event that had taken place approximately 74,000 years ago on the island of Sumatra. He named the site Toba. He stated that the eruption had released more than 2,800 cubic kilometers of volcanic material, making it the largest explosive eruption of the Quaternary period. He stated that the ash cloud had spread across a substantial portion of the northern hemisphere, and he stated that the event had come closer to extinguishing the human species than any other event in the preceding million years. In 1889, the Toba caldera had not been identified as the source of a major eruption. The scientific tools required to date volcanic ash layers with precision did not exist. The concept of a genetic bottleneck, which would later become central to the Toba hypothesis, would not be developed until the mid-20th century. Halley had no basis for any of his claims. The Toba supereruption was formally identified and dated in the late 20th century. Radiometric dating placed the event at approximately 74,000 years before present. Volumetric estimates confirmed the eruption as the largest of the Quaternary. Ash layers attributable to Toba have been identified in sediment cores across India, the Arabian Peninsula, East Africa, and the South China Sea. The eruption ejected material with a force that dwarfs every historical volcanic event in recorded history combined. What makes Halley's pamphlet particularly unsettling is the genetic claim. He wrote that human populations at the time of the Toba eruption had been reduced to fewer than 10,000 breeding individuals. He wrote that the bottleneck was so severe that every human alive today descends from a population that could have fit inside a medium-sized town. He wrote that the species had come within a generation of disappearing entirely. In 1998, geneticist Stanley Ambrose formalized what became known as the Toba catastrophe theory. Mitochondrial DNA analysis had revealed a genetic bottleneck in the human lineage dating to approximately the same period as the Toba eruption. The surviving breeding population was estimated at between 3,000 and 10,000 individuals. The match with Halley's century-old pamphlet was exact. Subsequent genetic studies have refined the numbers, but have not overturned the core finding. Humanity passed through a needle so narrow that the diversity we observe today in our species is, by comparison with every other large mammal, pathologically low. Halley's pamphlet ended with a passage his contemporaries found incomprehensible. He wrote that Toba was not the only such event recorded in the geological column. He listed 3 other supervolcanic complexes: Yellowstone in North America, Taupo in New Zealand, and the Phlegraean Fields in Italy, and stated that each had produced eruptions of comparable magnitude in the deeper past and would produce them again. He did not predict dates. He predicted inevitability. The geological record is unambiguous on this point. The only variable is the interval, and the interval is not long. Yellowstone's most recent major eruption occurred approximately 630,000 years ago. Taupo's last supereruption occurred approximately 26,000 years ago. The Phlegraean Fields have shown measurable ground deformation and seismic activity across the past 2 decades. None of these systems is dormant in the geological sense. They are merely quiet in the human sense, which is a distinction without meaningful difference on the timescales Halley described. Number 3. The warning about the creature that walked beside us. In 1954, a librarian in Edinburgh named Colin McFarlane submitted an unpublished manuscript to several university presses. Every press rejected it. The manuscript made claims that had no basis in the science of the period. McFarlane stated that a second species of human had existed alongside our own ancestors until approximately 40,000 years ago. He stated that this species was not a primitive precursor, but a parallel development, with a brain equal in size to our own, complex tool use, symbolic behavior, and burial practices. He stated that our ancestors had interbred with them, and he stated that traces of their DNA would be found in every non-African human alive today. In 1954, Neanderthals were understood as brutish, slouching, intellectually limited creatures. The reconstruction popularized by Marcellin Boule in the early 20th century depicted them as subhuman. The idea that they had possessed cognitive abilities comparable to modern humans was scientifically unacceptable. The idea of genetic admixture between species was not merely unsupported, it was outside the conceptual framework of the field. Every element of McFarlane's manuscript has since been confirmed. Revised anatomical analyses in the 1970s and 1980s overturned the Boule reconstruction. Neanderthals walked upright with a skeletal structure nearly identical to our own. Their brain size, measured by endocranial volume, matched or exceeded the average for modern humans. Evidence of tool manufacture, pigment use, ornamental objects, and deliberate burial accumulated steadily across decades of excavation. The Shanidar site in Iraq yielded a Neanderthal burial associated with pollen concentrations consistent with the deliberate placement of flowers. The genetic confirmation arrived in 2010. A team led by Svante Pabo at the Max Planck Institute published the first draft of the Neanderthal genome, assembled from bone fragments recovered at Chauvet Cave in Croatia. The analysis revealed that every living human with ancestry outside sub-Saharan Africa carries between 1 and 4% Neanderthal DNA. The interbreeding had occurred. It had occurred repeatedly, and the genetic legacy persists in the immune systems, the metabolism, and the neurological architecture of billions of people alive today. What makes McFarlane's manuscript particularly disturbing is the section his editors rejected most forcefully. He wrote that the disappearance of the Neanderthals was not an extinction in the conventional sense. They did not die out from cold, from disease, or from competition. They were absorbed. A smaller, more numerous, more fecund population moved into their territories and diluted them out of existence across approximately 10,000 years of contact. The final Neanderthals, he wrote, were individuals whose children were more like us than like them. Their lineage ended not in a grave, but in the slow erasure of a gene pool, too small to resist, the larger one pressing against it. In 2015, a fossil jawbone recovered from a cave in Romania, dated to between 37,000 and 42,000 years ago, was sequenced and found to contain Neanderthal DNA at levels consistent with a Neanderthal great-great-grandparent. The individual was not a Neanderthal, but a Neanderthal had been alive within living memory of his birth. McFarlane's framework, dismissed in 1954, is now the textbook description of how one intelligent species replaced another. Not through conquest, through the slow biological arithmetic of being outnumbered. McFarlane's manuscript closed with a question that has been repeated in academic commentary ever since. He asked what it means that we remember nothing of them. Our genes carry them. Our immune systems were built by them. Our ancestors loved them well enough to produce children with them across thousands of generations. And yet we have no myth, no story, no cultural memory that preserves their existence. We erase them from our awareness as thoroughly as we absorb them into our biology. And the question he left unanswered is whether we are the descendants of the victors, or whether we are simply the ones who survived long enough to forget. Subsequent genomic work has added further weight to McFarlane's framework in ways he could not have foreseen. Studies published between 2014 and 2020 identified specific Neanderthal gene variants that persist in modern human populations and contribute to immune function, skin pigmentation, hair structure, circadian rhythm regulation, and susceptibility to certain diseases. The genetic legacy is not a passive residue. It is functional, active, and measurable in the bodies of billions of people who have never heard the word Neanderthal spoken in connection with their own ancestry. McFarlane had written that the absorbed lineage would continue to shape the absorbers long after the absorbed had ceased to exist as a distinct population. The statement was speculative in 1954. It is now a description of documented biological reality. Number 2. the warning about the impact that made us. In April 1943, an American physicist named Lawrence Hallett, working on classified wartime research, submitted a private memorandum to colleagues at the University of Chicago. The memorandum had nothing to do with his official work. It described an event that had taken place approximately 4.5 billion years ago, in the earliest period of the solar system's formation. Hallett stated that a planetary body, roughly the size of Mars, had collided with the proto-Earth. He stated that the collision had ejected enough material into orbit to form the Moon. He stated that the impact had stripped away the young Earth's initial atmosphere and replaced it with a denser, water-bearing envelope derived from the impactor. And he stated that without this collision, life on Earth would never have emerged. In 1943, the origin of the Moon was unresolved. Competing theories proposed capture, co-accretion, or fission from a rapidly spinning Earth. The giant impact hypothesis, which Hallett described in detail, would not be formally proposed until 1975. The idea that the collision had reshaped Earth's atmosphere and provided the conditions for biochemistry was beyond the scientific vocabulary of the period. The giant impact hypothesis is now the consensus explanation for the Moon's formation. Isotopic analysis of lunar samples returned by the Apollo missions confirmed that the Moon and Earth share an almost identical oxygen isotope signature, consistent with the two bodies having formed from the same mixed debris. Computational simulations conducted from the 1980s onward have refined the scenario Hallett described. A body roughly the size of Mars, given the name Theia, struck the proto-Earth at a glancing angle. The energy released vaporized substantial portions of both bodies. The debris formed a ring around the Earth that coalesced into the Moon within approximately 100 years. What makes Hallett's memorandum particularly unsettling is the claim about habitability. He wrote that the Earth we inhabit is not the planet that originally formed in our orbit. It is the hybrid produced by a collision. The stabilizing gravitational influence of the Moon, which moderates the tilt of Earth's rotational axis and prevents the chaotic climate swings observed on Mars, is a consequence of the impact. The iron core of the Earth, enlarged by the addition of Theia's core, generates the magnetic field that shields the surface from solar radiation. The water on Earth, long assumed to have arrived via comet bombardment, is now understood to have been present in significant quantities within the impactor itself. Every condition required for complex life, the stable climate, the protective magnetic field, the abundant surface water, she traces its origin to a single collision between two planetary bodies in the first 100 million years of the solar system's existence. Without that impact, the Earth would be a Venus-like greenhouse or a Mars-like desert. Complex life would not have had the time, the stability, or the chemistry required to emerge. Hallett's closing passage is the one that was classified alongside his wartime work and released only decades later. He wrote that the probability of such a collision producing a habitable world is vanishingly small. The angle of impact, the velocity, the composition of the bodies, the resulting distribution of material, all fall within a range so narrow that the recreation of similar conditions in simulation requires extraordinary fine-tuning. He wrote that we are not the product of gradual planetary evolution. We are the product of an accident. And the accident was improbable enough that its recurrence anywhere else in the galaxy is not guaranteed by the number of stars. Number 1. The warning about the thing beneath the layer. In March 2001, a geologist named Victor Halvorsen delivered a lecture at a small academic conference in Trondheim, Norway, that was not recorded and survives only through the notes of attendees. He spent the first portion of his lecture reviewing established findings in sedimentology. He spent the second portion describing an event that he claimed had occurred approximately 550 million years ago, immediately before the beginning of the Cambrian period. He called the event the signal. He stated that the fossil record contains evidence of a deliberate intervention in the biosphere of the late Precambrian, and that the Cambrian explosion, the sudden appearance of nearly every major animal body plan within a geological instant, was the response. In 2001, the Cambrian explosion was recognized as one of the most significant events in the history of life. The sudden diversification of complex animals after more than 3 billion years of microbial dominance remained, and remains, imperfectly explained. Conventional theories invoke rising oxygen levels, the evolution of predation, genetic innovations in developmental biology, or some combination of the three. Halvorsen proposed none of these. He proposed that the record itself contained something anomalous. He described thin layers of sediment dating to the period immediately preceding the Cambrian, layers whose chemical composition could not be reproduced by any known natural process. He described isotopic signatures that suggested the presence of materials not manufactured by biological, geological, or cosmic mechanisms available in that era. He described the distribution of these layers across widely separated locations on multiple continents, indicating a global rather than localized phenomenon. And he described his conviction that the sudden emergence of complex life, immediately afterward, was causally linked to whatever had produced the anomaly. Halvorsen's lecture was not published. He did not submit his findings to peer review. Within 2 years, he had retired from academic work and withdrawn from all professional activity. His notes were preserved by a colleague and surfaced publicly only in 2019. By that time, independent research had begun to identify anomalies consistent with his descriptions. Studies of late Ediacaran strata published in the 2010 reported unusual concentrations of trace elements in layers dated to roughly 550 million years ago. The anomalies remain unexplained within the conventional framework. Multiple teams have proposed alternative natural mechanisms. None has achieved consensus. What makes Halvorsen's warning particularly disturbing is the claim he made about the future. He stated that the signal was not a single event. It was the first of a sequence. He stated that the record contains similar anomalies at the boundary of the Permian and Triassic periods, at the boundary of the Cretaceous and Paleogene, and at a third location he did not specify in sufficient detail for it to be identified with certainty. He stated that each anomaly corresponds to a major transition in the biosphere. Each one resets the scaffolding of life on this planet, and each one, he stated, was produced by the same mechanism. He did not name the mechanism. He did not speculate on its origin. He did not describe its intentions. What he described was a pattern. Every time complex life on Earth has been pruned back to a smaller, simpler remnant, something has occurred at the boundary layer that the sedimentary record cannot explain. And every time the pruning has been followed by a rapid expansion into new forms, the anomaly appears again in the stratum above. Halvorsen's final statement, recorded in the notes of the one attendee who wrote it down in full, it addressed the present. He stated that the next anomaly in the record has not yet been deposited, that the layer corresponding to our own period is still forming, still accumulating, still open to whatever will be added to it before the sediment hardens. He stated that the sequence he identified operates on intervals measured in tens of millions of years, and that we are approaching the end of one such interval. And he stated that the creatures in the layer beneath us, the ones that thought themselves permanent, had no warning before the signal arrived. The record resets. The clock continues, and the thing that watches for the moment to intervene does not announce itself. It simply waits until the scaffolding is ready to be replaced, and then it lays down the next layer. Halvorsen's notes contain a final fragment that his colleague preserved without commentary. He wrote that every intelligent species that has ever examined its own planet's stratigraphic record has asked the same question. They have all wondered what produced the boundaries. They have all developed theories involving asteroids, supervolcanoes, climate shifts, or gamma-ray bursts. And they have all been wrong, not because the natural mechanisms do not exist, but because the natural mechanisms are incidental. The boundary is laid down first. The extinction follows. The species that reads the record afterward never realizes that the causation runs in the opposite direction to what they assumed. By the time the pattern becomes clear, the layer containing their own remains has already begun to form. If you want to see more videos like this, click the video on screen now and make sure to subscribe.